Good morning. Good morning, everyone. How was everybody this morning after a lovely St. Patty's Day last night? So everybody doing all right? Perfect. Good morning, everyone. My name is April Elston. I am the Senior Manager of the Whiskey and Research and Innovation Team for the James B. Beam Distilling Company, and really excited to hear the speakers today on grain selection. I know this is absolutely something that our team looks at quite often, so really excited to hear what the folks have to say. So first, I'm going to introduce Christopher Seitz. One thing before we start, if you do have a question at the end, please wait till someone comes and gives you the mic. Because we want everything recorded, you have to actually speak into the mic for it to be recorded. So if you do, when we have questions, just raise your hand, please. Thank you. All right. So Christopher Seitz. So a little bit about Christopher. Christopher's start in the beer business was as a delivery driver for Miller in Milwaukee during college. He graduated from the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Management with a Bachelor of Science degree in business in 1987, and eventually started working for the Summit Brewing Company in 1989, where he left as Vice President of Operations in 2010 to run a small entrepreneurship dedicated to teaching children about renewable energy. After discovering that he really missed the beer business, he started selling malt and hops in 2012 and later joined Malt Europe in 2017. He has completed his MBA at the University of St. Thomas and is passionate about the brewing and distilling business where his colleagues, customers, and competitors can all call one another friends. So please welcome Chris.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a wonderful opportunity to speak today, especially with my esteemed colleagues, Aaron and Scott. It's nice to be up here on the podium with you guys. So thank you for the opportunity. I also want to pay credit to Sam Anderson, is our raw material officer at Malt Europe. He prepared some of the information for this presentation. Unfortunately, or fortunately, he is out conducting farm sustainability audits this week. So many, many miles traveled and unfortunately could not attend today. So thank you to Sam. So what I'd like to cover today is just where does distillers malt fit into the barley supply chain, and why is it unique, why is it special? So I'll talk about where barley is grown in North America, a brief history of the acreage, where it's grown, why it's grown there, and the change over time. We'll also talk about barley breeding and how barley varieties have changed over time. And then we'll talk a little bit about the art of the farmer, the art of the maltster, and describe some of that unique supply chain for distillers malt. My goal is for you to have a deeper understanding of where your barley is coming from and how important grain distilling or bourbon distilling is for the North American supply chain. All right, what you see here is a map of Canada, obviously. The green areas highlight where barley is currently being grown across Canada. And you can see the dark areas of Canada, that's the Alberta prairie, is the highest concentration of barley. There are some grown in Saskatchewan and also a smaller amount in Manitoba. Canada is the 5th largest producer of barley malt globally, produces about 9 to 10 million metric tons annually. Most of that goes to the feed market. There is some that goes to the U.S. for malting. And as you can see on the map, everything kind of butts up to the Rockies in the Alberta prairie. Corn is starting to creep into Manitoba. We're growing corns in areas of the U.S. and Canada that we've never grown corn before. So everything is moving west. These maps, obviously, of the U.S. We have two very different maps. On the left, we have the barley growing regions of 2004. And on the right, we see 2023. So barley used to be a crop that was grown widely across the United States. Now, as in Canada, it's grown mostly in the northern plains, butting up against the Rockies. The U.S. produces about 1/3 of what Canada produces, 3 to 4 million metric tons of barley annually. And it's important to remember that the United States is a net importer of barley. We do not produce enough barley in the U.S. to satisfy the total demand, so we do rely upon our nearest neighbor, Canada, to produce barley for us. As the acreage and production, it's important to note that as acreage over time is decreasing, as maltsters, we have less barley to select from. Barley going into the malting has very specific requirements, and when we're growing less and less of it, we have less to choose from. Now let's look at some of the history that's impacted that acreage over time and take a look at what's going on. So if we take that map of the United States where we see the acreage is declining over time, and we specifically look at the top 6 producing states in the United States, that's Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Minnesota, North Dakota, Colorado, and Wyoming. We can see over time, we plot that out, that the amount of barley being grown in the U.S. is going down. On the left, we've got 1946, and on the right, it's kind of hard to see all the way out, is 2022. So let's take a peek at the history that led to these declines. First event is post-World War II. As we take some of that industrial technology that we use to help us win World War II, that's turned towards the agricultural complex, and we start making improvements. The first combine in the picture helps farmers grow more. So we see small grains increasing in acreage post-World War II. Next, we have what's referred to as the Green Revolution. Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution and a Nobel laureate, introduces the dwarf wheat. This dwarf wheat helps farmers produce more grain. It's easier to grow, and it's easier to harvest. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize because what he did for the small grain industry across the globe helped global famine. The next, we see this peak in the middle. Barley is a grain that is fairly drought resistant. So the 80s are marked by a period of drought, and we see acreage going up to the peak. But then we also see barley acreage coming back down on the other side of the drought. So while barley is drought resistant, it does need a certain amount of water at critical times during its growth period to survive. So on both sides of that drought, we see acreage going up and we see it coming back down. Then kind of post-80s, we see the introduction of Roundup Ready corn, genetically modified corn and soybeans, and we start seeing corn acreage go up. We start seeing corn grown in areas that historically would not support growing corn. The ethanol industry picks up. Subsidies and support by the government sees the ethanol industry take off. That has a kind of a knock-on effect in that, barley was used as a feed in the U.S. until this period of time. With all the ethanol plants coming online, they produce a generous amount of dried distillers grains, so it kind of wipes out the barley as a feed market in the United States. So barley in the U.S. begins its slow migration to the west as well, and we're seeing it being pushed to areas where corn and soy doesn't go. And then lastly, here's where we are today. Barley is a specialty crop. It is not a commodity. You're not going to see barley traded in the futures market on the Chicago Board of Trade. It is a specialty crop in the U.S. It's almost entirely under contract. And then Canada, there's a little bit more of a wide open market, but again, most of that is going to feed. Let's take a look at over time. As the acreage was declining and moving west, what happens to the barley plant itself? And as over time, as we're breeding barley, we'll look at this slide, we'll see the yield. So the good news is, the bad news is the acreage is going down, but the good news is the barley yields were going up with breeding modern varieties that would just bring more value to the farmer. So this slide goes from 1978 to 2023. And we can see that there is a 15% increase in yield over time. So that helps offset some of that loss in acreage. The next slide, also an indication of yield, is kernel plumpness. So over the same time, as yield is increasing, so is the size and the plumpness of the kernel. And as a kernel gets more plump, it has more plant starches available as a sugar source when brewers are making beer. So as the yields are going up, kernel plumpness is going up. And again, that plumpness is an indication of starch content. The next slide, and this is important for when we're talking about distiller's malt, is during the same time as plumpness is going up, due to the inverse relationship between plumpness or starch content and protein, we see protein levels coming down. And so as protein levels come down, the plumpness goes up. It's an inverse relationship. And note on the left side of the chart, I think there's a laser here, up top here, this 13% protein level is the level that as maltsters we are targeting for good distiller's malt. Protein drives diastatic power and alpha amylase. So the higher the protein, the more enzymes we get out of it. So this is kind of flying right in the face of making good distiller's malt to see protein levels going down. However, it's good for the brewers because the brewing market drives the malt market. I know that's hard for everyone to hear in this room, but that's the reality. Brewers drive the malting market. So this is why the proteins are coming down. Now let's move on. We'll talk a little bit about the art of the farmer. The art and the science of growing barley, and the importance of distiller's grain to the farmer. All right, I've often been quoted as saying there's three craftswomen or craftsmen in the process of making good spirits. The first craftsman is the farmer. What the farmer does has a tremendous impact on what turns into malt and then gets converted or turned into, processed into beer or spirits. So the farmer is the first in line. And this is where terroir, barley variety, and farming practices can all have a tremendous impact on the quality and the functionality of the barley that goes into malt. And it's important to keep in mind that barley farming is very unique in the fact that to make good malt, we need to keep that barley alive from start to finish. If the barley is dead or it won't germinate, it will not malt. So in the previous session, we saw how important it was for farmers to take care of their bins, take care of the grain. I'm here to tell you it's even more important when we're storing barley on the farm. It needs to be kept aerated, kept dry, and it needs to be kept alive. If it's not living, it's not going to make malt, and it becomes garbage in, garbage out, right? So what does that mean? What does grain distilling mean to the farmer? It's important that we start with the distinction. I've already highlighted there's a difference between brewer's malt and distiller's malt. A brewer's malt, a brewer is looking for the starch. That's the source of fermentable sugars for a brewer. On the other side, if you're making bourbon or Tennessee whiskey, you're looking for the enzyme package. So they're different animals. And keep in mind, when a farmer is growing barley, one of the challenges is making specification. We often, when we meet with our farmers, it's curious, and a question we often ask is, why do you grow barley? Because in a typical year, they may or may not get selected for their quality. So 2 out of 3 years, 3 out of 4 years, they make the quality, and then that off year, they don't make quality, and then it gets rejected and sent as feed. However, protein being just one of those specifications for the barley, if a farmer happens to produce barley that's high protein, doesn't necessarily make good brewer's malt, it will make high quality distiller's malt. So the distilling market gives that farmer a little bit of security in his supply chain, his contract, and his price, because it does not have to go to feed if it doesn't make brewer spec. All right, the second craftsman. So the second craftsman in this line is the maltster. So let's talk about how grain distilling is important for the maltster as well, in terms of the malt that they produce. So the maltster takes what Mother Nature provides it and processes it into a consistent product that gets delivered to distillers or brewers, something that's homogeneous, and it's the same at the beginning of the year as it is at the end of the year. The maltster, much like a distiller, is a batcher. You can blend and take batches of different varieties, different malts, different protein levels, and blend them into something that meets each customer's specifications or expectations. So grain distilling, in malting, that high protein material not only gives the farmer some stability in their supply chain, but it also gives the maltster. We produce malt for the food segment. Typically that can be a higher enzyme product as well, not quite as high as distillers. So having that range of segments where we can use different proteins, again, taking what Mother Nature has provided us, and giving us some supply chain adaptability, so that the high protein material also gives the maltster some opportunities. Not everything going in and out of the malt house has to be low protein barley. So we've said that brewing drives the malting market, but the food and the distilling segments are just as important for that supply chain stability and the opportunity for flexibility within inventory. Let's talk about some of the risks to the grain distilling supply chain, the barley supply chain. Starting at the top, of course, is the price of fertilizer. Fertilizer is a source of nitrogen and also helps drive some of that protein to make good high enzyme distillers malt that meets expectations. So anytime there's an increase or instability in the fertilizer market, that's a challenge. That is a risk. GN0 barley is a bit of a risk to the barley supply chain. The simple fact of the matter is there is not enough GN0 barley grown in the US or Canada to fully meet the distiller's demand for malt. We're getting there, but the variety development takes time. Developing a new barley variety, and Scott's going to talk to this, takes time. It takes time, energy, resources, and dollars to bring a new variety to market. Of course, the other risk is other crops. Farmer needs to get paid. So other crops, if there's more demand for other crops, such as corn, soy, or canola, and that's an opportunity for the farmer to make more money, they will do so. So barley needs to compete. And of course, climate instability. Last 5 years, as my Maltsters in the room will attest, has been tough. Mother Nature has not been kind to the crop, and we've seen quality all over the board, going up and down. And lastly, but not least, the T word, tariffs. Tariffs are going to be a risk simply from the fact they're bringing instability to the markets, instability and uncertainty. And farmers are risk averse as well. And if they perceive there's going to be instability in the market, they will exit. And again, it's important to remember that barley, we are in the U.S. are net importers of barley. So let's get to the key takeaways and wrap this up so we have time for some questions. So the key takeaways I want you to leave the room with. So barley is a unique specialty crop. We must process it. It needs to be kept alive so we can make good malt. It's not number 2 corn. Barley must perform agronomically. The farmer needs to get paid. They want to make a profit, maintain their livelihood, so barley needs to be a competitive crop. Barley is a drought-resistant crop that's woven into the northern plains of the U.S. and Canada, and it's going to play an important part in water conservation and greenhouse gas emission reductions over time. There's tremendous opportunity with barley. Bourbon or grain distillers present a unique opportunity within the larger barley malt market for reducing risk, stabilizing the supply chain, and supporting all 3 craftsmen in the process. And lastly, I'll leave you with this. Get involved. Get involved with your maltster. Ask questions. What are your specifications? What are your expectations? What varieties do you want to see? Participate. Join AMBA. Join CMBTC. Have a voice, and we'll all move together in this industry together. So thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Does anyone have anything?
Oh, here it comes from Reed.
You know, there's always going to be one. All right, so as beer continues to fall and kind of the trends are changing, do you foresee a possibility of us returning to some higher protein malts, specifically the approval of like more 6-row rather than 2-row? We've kind of switched all the way to 2-row, but do you think 6-row might make a comeback?
Oh, I don't know that 6-row is going to make a comeback. There's still pockets of it. There's still customers that are looking for it, but you need to follow the money. There's no dollars going into breeding of new 6-row varieties, simply because 2-row yields more to the farmer. And if the farmer, either the farmer's going to have to get paid a premium to grow 6-row, or they're going to move on to 2-row simply because agronomically it delivers more. Now, on the subject of high protein barley, for brewing, I do think that the brewers who are demanding low protein barley year in and year out need to take a hard look at what they're trying to achieve, because continuing to push barley onto irrigated ground to make low protein in a time of climate instability is hard. And that pushes the supply chain to deliver on that. And if we're going to look at greenhouse gas reductions and water reductions, we need to find barley varieties that do well in dry land. And unfortunately, that's going to come at a cost of protein. So I do think brewers will have to adjust their expectations if climate instability continues.
On the subject of tariffs, do you anticipate impacts, reduced planting in Canada as a result of the tariffs this summer?
That's a really good question. Farmers are making those decisions right now. And again, when there is uncertainty and instability, a farmer will avoid that. Now we do, globally, we're at a bit of a low point in global barley carryovers, and particularly low in the U.S. and Canada as well. So there's still some demand there to kind of backfill some of that. Yeah, the tariffs, I'm sure as, everyone's dealing with it, but nobody has the answers, right? So all we can do is project and try to predict what's going to happen, and that is proving to be difficult. Good questions. Thank you.
Let's thank Christopher. Thank you. All right. Moving on to the next talk, as Christopher just talked about on low and no GN. Scott Garden is the Director of Technical Services for Great Western Malting. His responsibilities include company quality initiatives as well as managing the research and development efforts of the company's Malt Innovation Center. With over 25 years of industry experience, Scott has developed an extensive and varied technical background. Prior to coming to Great Western, he was Vice President of Technical and Innovations for John I. Haas, Inc., where he was responsible for quality and research programs for hops and brewing. Scott's academic background includes a PhD in food chemistry from the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, and an MBA from the University of Washington. So let's welcome Scott.
So thank you, April. Can you hear me? Okay. Got this thing operating. So thank you for that kind introduction here, and it's a pleasure to actually, we got to keep this a little closer, pleasure to present at this conference. As you can see here from the title of my slide, we're going to talk about barley variety development, and we're going to talk about a particular variety, or note a variety called Top Shelf here. I want to point your attention to that graphic in the middle. It was produced by the breeder of Top Shelf, Dr. Pat Hayes. The graphic shows somebody reaching up, hopefully with good safety equipment, to the top shelf of your local bar and finding a non-GN bottle of spirits at the top shelf. And it was Pat's aspiration that his variety would be part of a premium product and be able to attain this top shelf recognition. There we go. So a little on my background, you've heard a little bit already here. I've had 30 years in the brewing industry, malt and hops, and the last 10 I've spent learning a lot about the distilling industry. I'm responsible for quality R&D, sustainability programs, and worked with both private and public breeding programs. So our scope for today is talk a little bit about barley production, focus on US and Canada. It was interesting listening to Chris' presentation. I think my presentation is very complimentary to what you're saying, so without any planning, we're kind of on the same page here, which would be expected, I guess, in our industry. We focus on new variety development. We'll talk a little bit about that, organizations, timing and risk that's involved here, and what makes a variety appealing to stakeholders with a focus on distilling. And of course, we'll mention Top Shelf along the way. World barley production, this map provides an overview. Last year, there were about 142.5 million metric tons of barley produced in the world. You can see here, most in the Northern Hemisphere, really concentrated in Europe. This map shows yellow, sort of some barley, green more, and the darker areas kind of the most production. There are barley producing areas in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia, a little in Africa, and South America here in Argentina. But as we talked about here, we're going to focus a little more on North America, zoom in on that area. And as you can see here, Chris and my numbers differ a little bit. I think yours is a 3-year average, but they're in the same ballpark here with it. So in Canada, main barley producing provinces up there, 89% of the barley production resides in Alberta and Saskatchewan, with Alberta being sort of the dominant producer at about 52%. In the US, you can see here 4 major states that produce 83% of the US barley, with Idaho leading the way at just under 39%. So I want to talk a little bit about barley as a specialty crop. That was already mentioned, so I won't go into too much detail, but really, it's a crop that is contracted with very little open market, as Chris alluded to here. Canadian crop, of course, is a little bigger, but as mentioned, has feed and forage varieties, and malting quality barley is limited and in demand with it. I've listed some other crops here, sort of where barley falls within other crops. These are 2024 production. You can see barley at about 3 million metric tons there. But the key takeaway, and my slide got a little messed up, I think, in this presentation. Yeah, so what they said here at the top, barley production is about 0.55% out of all these varieties, at corn at 66%. And really, you've heard the phrase, corn is king. And it really, corn production really dwarfs barley production in terms of volume. In fact, corn is over double the metric tonnage of the world crop of barley. So here, a little bit about the landscape. We've talked initially here, barley is an important crop economically, but really not a large influential crop in the U.S. As with any crop, new varieties are key to ensuring barley remains desirable and competitive for our growers and our producers. Varieties are developed globally, but I want to stress, and we've adopted some of these varieties in the U.S., global varieties, but it's really important to maintain a domestic breeding program because you need varieties that are designed for our areas. Variety development is a collaborative effort, requires sustained investment and the ability to accept risk. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So how does this process actually work? This slide here, we're going to go through and take a look at some of the stakeholders here that are involved with it here. And stakeholders, I've listed some here being growers, maltsters, distillers, brewers, food company. We're all serving here the consumer who we want to, desire these products that we produce. And so to have these barleys available for our products and the consumers, we rely on breeding organizations. These are typically both public and private, public being universities, government organizations such as USDA ARS, which is an important organization for keeping barley research going. There are some private organizations too. There's brewers who develop their own varieties. Anheuser-Busch and Molson Coors are variety developers for themselves. And there's seed companies, primarily in Europe, where we can look to for some varieties as well. Making this all work are some facilitating organizations. I want to call out AMBA for their work they do, American Malting Barley Association, being great advocates for barley development in the U.S. BMBRI is a similar company in Canada that does really good work. There are grower organizations and state commissions supporting barley. And one committee I wanted to point out too is the National Barley Improvement Committee. This is a committee that brings together all of these groups here. They are big advocates for federal funding to ensure that we have a stable and viable domestic breeding programs here. So they do good work. So what do people desire from new varieties here? And I think I wanted to sum it up in sort of one term. Varieties have to provide compelling economic value here. There has to be some really undeniable reason to want to adopt a new variety. What we're hoping is any variety that we adopt, adds value to our supply chain here. So what are growers looking for? Growers are typically looking for something that delivers yield. They're also looking for things that require minimal inputs in terms of fertilizers, pesticides, water, energy, and they're looking for varieties that provide them a good operational fit. And when I say that, some growers are looking for varieties that can provide a second crop during the year or a good rotational crop for them, besides the ones that just grow only barley. For the maltster, we're looking for varieties that are, we'll call it malt friendly with dependable quality. We're looking for varieties that we call kind of multitaskers, those that can produce more than one product. There's only so much space in the world to store barley and only so many acres to grow it on. So we want barley varieties that actually can do a number of different jobs. And we want barleys that contribute to our sustainability programs. For the distiller, I won't get into too much here. I'm sure you all can think of many reasons for wanting a new variety or many parameters that you're looking for, but I'll just say you're probably looking for things in the performance area, you're looking for things in the flavor area, and you're looking for things in the sustainability area. So improvements there when it comes to new varieties. Getting a little deeper into quality, this slide here has a lot of items that I won't go into any detail on. If you want to talk about it later, happy to go through these parameters with you. This table was developed by the AMBA here, a group of maltsters, distillers, and brewers here, and it provides guidelines to breeders about what things they should be targeting with respect to barley and malt quality. It's really general guidance, and it's really not a specification, but does, as I say, point people in a direction when it comes to developing new varieties. The boxed area, sort of the middle and outer columns there, are areas where the distiller has some interest. Middle column being those parameters that might be interesting to an all malt distiller, and the outer column there being those that might be interested in grain distilling qualities, sort of that high enzymatic category. In the middle here, and I've highlighted in blue, glycosidic nitrile. Chris touched upon that, the importance of taking a look at varieties that provide what we call lower, to no glycosidic nitrile. Really, if you can measure it down far enough, you'll probably find something, but really less than 0.5 grams per metric ton is really acceptable to be what we call a non-GN style variety. Won't get into this too much because I think you're all familiar with ethyl carbamate, and it's a product that comes from barleys with glycosidic nitrile. This graphic on the side shows that it's really a multi-step procedure here on going from GN and barley to EC and distillates here. We actually do have non-GN barleys at this moment for all malt distillers, but really needing better offerings for those looking for a higher enzymatic malt. So the challenge we accepted many years back was to take a look at this area and try to find a new variety that would service more of our bourbon or Tennessee whiskey style customers. So this led us on what we call the road to top shelf here. We talked about these quality targets. These are things we looked into, and as well as adding non-GN potential. Some of my colleagues here on the right-hand side in this picture, they've been working for a number of years, helping with the development of new varieties with it, and we have lots of good discussions on what we need and what's up and coming. I'm going to mention, one of our visions for the new variety was to look at a winter variety. We'll talk a little more about that later. A little bit about some previous introductions. We were responsible for establishing Odyssey, which is a UK non-GN all malt distilling variety in our growing regions. And I want to talk a little bit, we'll talk a little bit more later about Oregon State University. This is an important breeding program for us. They were the first one, I think, first domestic non-GN variety called Full Pint came out of that program here. It was more designed for brewing, not necessarily with distilling, but happened to be a non-GN. We've also worked with Oregon State on a variety called Thunder. It's a winter variety, good protein modification, but unfortunately does have GN. So what about winters? As their name suggests, winter varieties are planted in the fall, harvested early summer. Advantages of winter varieties is they're able to utilize winter and spring moisture very well. They have an early harvest window here, so it avoids some of that summer heat that we've been seeing in recent years. Some of the disease pressures that come on, and exposure to late season rain. Late season rain can be a problem because it can lead to pre-harvest sprout, which makes that barley a little more difficult to malt. Winter varieties allow for a second crop during the growing season. This can be important to our growers, and they can provide an option for erosion control. So there's plant and roots in the ground over winter. But of course, there's some risks associated with winter. They're going to have to overwinter. We've got some pretty good varieties, but there's always a risk that we won't end up with a spring or summer crop if it's too harsh a winter, if the conditions aren't quite right. This is a slide I think I wanted to let you know about here. It's kind of this variety timeline, and as you can see, it's a fairly long process. I don't know if all of you are aware of how long it takes to actually bring a variety through. So not going to get into too many of the details, but there's basically time when the crosses are made and stabilized and a time of testing and scale up. This process is a significant time and resource commitment, as you can imagine. It involves many quality steps, verification steps that take place on a small scale. You're always evaluating things on test plots and micromalting scale, but it's really the commercial validation at the end of the process which is key. And this is where really things get important, because you're going to scale this variety up and you're going to malt it on a larger scale. And that's when kind of the rubber meets the road, I guess. This slide shows, I guess, what I consider the importance of having a strong domestic breeding program. As I mentioned, when we first considered Top Shelf and came up with our vision, this was in 2019, and we actually went to our Oregon State breeder, Dr. Pat Hayes, and talked to him. And I said, Pat, have you got anything interesting in your library that we could take a look at that might have the quality characteristics we're looking for? And he said, yes, I do. I actually made a cross back in 2015, and this is the first quality data that came out of that cross. So I think you can see it hopefully at the bottom of the slide here. That cross was initially labeled as DH162310. That was its number back then. And as you can see, it has some really good strong enzymatic content and really good protein modification. So this was all very positive, and we said, this is a variety we want to take a closer look at. If we look at some of the agronomic data, fast forwarding to today, so we can see that we've actually scaled this variety up, and it's actually performing, I'd say, quite well on a larger scale in terms of yield. If we look back a little bit at some of its agronomic data in our sort of small scale trials in Idaho, we can see here, down this side here, Top Shelf compared to some other varieties. Not necessarily the best of those varieties in terms of yield, but good. Had a good heading date here. Usually the shorter the better there. Plant height was good. We generally like the plant height to be not too high. Lodging was okay. It was, again, this is always indicative data, and this is the type of data you're looking at here, and you're going, okay, can we live with that? The answer in this case was yes. Spring stand overwintering was pretty good, not the best of the bunch, but it did have good disease resistance, bacterial leaf streak here. So this is one of the things with plant breeding and doing scale ups. You're always looking at small scale data, and you're always asking yourself, is this good enough? Can we take this variety forward? If we take a quick look at malt quality, we have Top Shelf listed with various protein levels. This came out of small plots near Corvallis, Oregon, and micromalted by the USDA. And we can see here at these different protein levels, we're still seeing a strong enzymatic content and good protein modification. So again, more small scale data that says we're on the right track. Oh, I'm getting down to the end, so we'll be quick here. So we've arrived at year 10 on this journey. And at this point, we're looking forward to our first commercial batch, which should happen at some point in this year. We've actually made the decision to scale up this variety, as you can see some of the data, but we will have a crop this summer of Top Shelf here. It's going to be really important at this point that we see the performance from this variety on the commercial scale. We need to see, again, gets back to that compelling economic value for our growers, for ourselves, and we need to test this variety with our customers and ensure that it's providing them the value with it. So stay tuned. Just some acknowledgements. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Clay, Dustin, and Paul Bacon, for all their help with this variety and other varieties over the years. I want to thank Dr. Pat Hayes and his colleagues Scott and Laura for their work with Top Shelf, and Dr. Margaret Krause, who's taken over for Pat Hayes. He recently retired, so we're looking forward to seeing some good varieties coming out of her program, hopefully. I want to thank Scott and Ashley from the American Malting Barley Association for all the hard work this organization does. And I want to thank some colleagues and collaborators in particular, Campbell Morrissey, Dr. Campbell Morrissey. He was Pat Hayes' grad student as we worked through the early data and the early development of Top Shelf. Dr. Harmony Bettenhausen, which I think is in this room. We've had a lot of good conversations on GN and quality over the years, Harmony and I, so I appreciate all her help. And Golden Valley Warehouses for their support in seed development and scale up of this variety. So I hope that there's something in this presentation that you found interesting, and I'll take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Any questions from the audience? I think we have a couple minutes. No? You have Brent.
Just curious how many acres of top shelf are in the ground right now.
What is it, Clay? 400 in the ground right now. I brought my agronomist here today, so anyway. Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for you. So, you know, we heard Christopher talk about the farmers and things like that. So, through these breeding programs, you know, where does the farmer come into play with that? Because I'm assuming like top shelf goes a little bit different maybe in the ground than Odyssey, or like what does that relationship look like between you and the farmer as you're bringing in these new varieties?
I think we're always working with our growers on these varieties. I think in some of the early stages, though, these are really test plot data. But as we scale up, we start to move these varieties out to our growing community with it, and hopefully have some really compelling data, as I talked about here, for them to actually grow these varieties. But we're very familiar with their capabilities, and we know, you know, as we go through the process, we're keeping in mind that this does have to be grown commercially, and we do have people that will be able to actually scale this up for us here.
Thank you. Any last questions? No? All right. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. All right. All right. Our last presenter, as he makes his way to the front, is Mr. Aaron Hyde. So Aaron is the commercial director for distilling at RAR BSG, one of the largest maltsters and distributors of distilling products in the U.S. Aaron has IBD certifications in brewing, malting, and distilling, and has authored a book on distilling. He has presented many times on the subject, and including at Craft Brewers Conference, the Worldwide Distilled Spirits Conference. He has also worked as a product manager for Bevy, is that correct? Bevy, where he led the development of ingredients for spirit production, the design of small homes, and pilot distillation equipment. So welcome, Aaron.
All right, thanks everyone for sticking around. Really set the stage with all the barley discussion for the malt discussion I'm going to have here on specialty malt for you, and considerations for its use in American single malt. So just so I've got a bit of a read on the room, how many people here have made or work for a company that's making American single malt at the moment? Awesome. Because specialty malt is very brewer driven, we talked about how barley is very driven by the brewer, so is specialty malt. Maybe we'll have some specialty malt that's distiller specific in the future. That's a dream. How many of you have worked in the brewing industry and are familiar with specialty malt? All right, good amount. Good. Awesome. So I'll cover a lot of the basics. I'm really hoping to kind of set the scene in terms of how specialty malt can be used, what you need to consider, what it is, and really hope to kind of lay the groundwork for your own education into this space. And hopefully in the future, we're presenting a lot more technical information in detail on this new designation and on specialty malt as well. So I'll just jump right in here. So I do want to define specialty malt. Really, malt can be made with any grain. We're going to talk about barley because we're talking about specialty malt, and you need to use malted barley in American single malt. It typically requires additional processing from your standard distiller's malt or brewer's malt, typically a little more heat, possibly a roast. It's really meant to drive flavor and aroma. If we were talking about beer, we'd also be talking about color and other attributes like head retention. We're not going to talk about that in distilling. But there are certain specialty malts you may just never use because they are there for body or head retention in beer. But a lot of the flavors that are derived from this are flavors that you're going to be familiar with, coming from oak or the current malt that you're using, toffee, nutty, toasted, biscuit, roasted flavors, coffee, that sort of thing. So a lot of times these malts can be used to accentuate familiar flavors. So it's not going to take your single malt whiskey in like a brand new direction most of the time, unless you get really creative. It's just going to really start to accentuate a lot of the flavors you're familiar with. So there is some perceived mouthfeel and sweetness that can come through from some of the components of these specialty malts, which is kind of a nice touch. And if you start doing some of this work yourself, you'll start to realize which malts those are. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. So from barley to malt. If you're not familiar with the process, I did want to throw a slide up there. So steeping the grain takes 2 or 3 days. This is really just hydrating the grain. You're getting 40 to 45% moisture in that grain. It's really expanding, and it starts to chit. It starts to show the plant. So the other thing about barley is we have to work with a live seed. It has to be a live plant for it to malt. Next step is germination. 4 to 6 days, very well controlled. It has to be turned constantly. I like to refer to what happens during germination if the malt isn't turned as felting. The roots start to grow, and the rootlets just will grow together, and that malt will just be forever in that Saladin box stuck if you don't turn this malt. You can get it out, but I mean, honestly, it's a bit more like a memory pad. You could probably sleep on it if you wanted to, if you didn't turn it. Kilning is the last step. That's heat. Knocks the rootlet off, adds some color, stabilizes really the starch and enzyme that was created during germination in there. Usually a low temperature, we're talking, I don't know, between 120 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the type of base malt you're using. And then the additional step for specialty malt is roasting. So unless it's a specialty malt, you typically wouldn't roast it. That knocks the enzymes out. The heat's too hot. But some of those malts do retain some of their starch during roasting. And we'll talk a little bit more about how those caramel and roasted malts are made as we talk about those malts. All right, so just to give you some categories and contributions of specialty malt, try to lay that baseline in terms of what's out there and what you can use in this space. So kiln malts that you're already familiar with, those are your standard base malts. There are specialty kilned base malts. Those would be things like Vienna and Munich. You may have actually already used some of these in your still, especially if you are making a single malt. A lot of folks have experimented with these. They create a lot of great malty and bready notes. And they can actually be utilized as 100% of your grain bill. So they're the outlier in the sense that they're sort of multi-talented in the sense that they have the starch, they have the enzyme, they have additional flavor. They're a great starting point for learning about specialty malts in American single malt whiskey. Highly kilned specialty malts like aromatic and melanoidin oftentimes drive away some of that enzyme, so you do need to have some base malt in there, but the biscuit, toast, and honey notes that are in some of those malts are really great. So that happens all in the kiln, typically at a higher temperature than those base malts, above 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and for a longer period of time. And you can kind of see in the picture there, I tried to choose a base malt and a higher kiln base, and you can start to see the color come through on the grain. So the roasted specialty malts typically are done in a roasting drum. Our caramels, crystals, we kind of classify them as one and the same. They literally have sugar crystallized inside of them. They're typically stewed and steeped, almost like mashed. There's like a mini mash happening inside that grain. And then as the temperature is raised, that sugar crystallizes inside and creates a really hard bead of sugar. Don't bite into caramel malt. So if you're tasting, you could literally break a tooth. So just a warning. Biscuit and lightly roasted malts, lower temperature roasted, you get really nutty, crusty sort of notes that come through from these malts. These malts have actually started to see a lot more pickup in single malt whiskeys globally, just to add that bready, biscuity, toasty note that a lot of folks are looking for that is sometimes harder to derive from a barrel. And then you've got dark roasted malts. Those are your chocolate malts and your black malts. The other one that's on there is roasted barley. That is just raw barley that gets roasted in the roaster. No malting process. It achieves a slightly different flavor. I always think of it as an extremely sort of burnt coffee espresso flavor that comes through from roasted barley, famously in most stouts that are out there, so Guinness and that sort of thing. All right, so considerations for inclusion. I did want to give some percentages here. If you're trialing, you can always use higher percentages just to taste a little bit more specialty malt. But just based on my trials, you know, those kiln specialty base malts, you can always go up to about 100%. But everything else in that 5 to 15% range is typically safe. The dark roasted malts, can start to get a little overbearing. Most of the testing that I've done and the tasting that I've done has been at 10%, but I haven't let that age out. I think the challenge would be how long you're willing to sit on that barrel with those grains in there. But if you can keep an overall inclusion rate of 1 to 20% on specialty malts, I think that's a really good starting point for most folks. Just one note, on some of those highly kiln malts, it's aromatic and melanoidin that I mentioned. We noticed that if you start to really play around with those malts in terms of the percentage you're using, the darker notes really start to come out of those malts, and that's kind of true of the dark roasted malts as well. If you start including larger amounts, you start to get the really dominant flavors almost becoming overbearing or singular in terms of what they offer. So we're going to talk about lots of different things you need to consider across American single malt and how they relate to specialty malt. One is if you're doing on grain versus off grain. On grain, you have to be careful with your specialty malts. You can get a really tannic flavor from some of these malts, so just be a little careful there. They will carry over a lot more in the spirit if you're doing on grain. If you can do off grain, it's worth trying because you can have a little bit more control over some of those acrid and mouth drying characteristics. One thing you can do that you're probably not familiar with unless you've done it in a brew house is you can actually cold steep a lot of these grains. You can actually put them in your fermenter directly, and you will get a lot of the characteristics without some of the tannic character. So that's something to consider as well. Feel free to be as conservative as you want if you're going on grain in terms of inclusion, and definitely consider some of those specialty base malts that we talked about, Munich, Vienna in particular, and caramel malts are actually really quite good with on grain. Their flavor is quite dynamic in an on grain mash. Other inclusion, attenuation, just keep in mind that specialty malts don't add as much starch as a base malt, and that they can affect the pH, and in terms of the fermentability, they vary quite greatly. You can convert a lot of them, but a lot of them, the starch just won't convert for you. It's been carbonized pretty much. So just keep in mind that this contribution isn't really about yield as much as it is about flavor and aroma, and small amounts can go a long way. Other considerations would be barrels used versus new. One thing that we've noticed sort of in market is when folks have started using specialty malt with new barrels, the flavors are amplified. I mean significantly amplified. So if you're using caramel malt and your barrel is deriving a lot of caramel flavor, you're just going to get a lot of caramel. And so it doesn't become quite as dynamic of a product as it could be. So just keep in mind that time is your friend if you're going into a new barrel and you're using specialty malts. These are going to be really interesting in terms of how they age in the barrel. Whereas used barrels, oftentimes you can use specialty malts to accentuate certain flavors, and they pair very well with used barrels. So keep in mind that if you do end up with a bit of a malt bomb, just like a barrel bomb, if you've just got a lot of flavor, it could still be a really nice blending barrel. Just give it time and put something a little more modest with it. All right, so yeast selection. I'm sure some of you have started playing around with yeast. You may have a house yeast strain. Depending on how many congeners and phenols you get from that yeast, you may you may start to get in the way of the specialty malt. High ester production yeasts can be really cool with specialty malt, or they can really get in the way of some of your malt flavors. One thing that I kind of want to start experimenting with is some of the high phenol yeast that's out there that creates that isoamyl acetate, and use it with some of those biscuit malts, because I think you could get a really cool like banana bread flavor. So there's an opportunity to actually pair your specialty malt with the type of phenols that you want to get from your yeast. I would just keep in mind that yeast can be as dominant a flavor as malt in a single malt whiskey. It is an extremely useful tool as long as you can use it right. And distillation methods. So, pot still, one thing that we found is that the congeners, esters that you get out of a specialty malt, single malt batch are really just really unique and interesting all the way throughout. And you might get greedy and try to grab a lot more off the top than you think you should. And some of those alcohols get tucked away. So it's tough sometimes to determine exactly where you want to make those cuts on a pot still. I would say on a column, it's a lot easier. The flavors become more delicate. The alcohols expose themselves a little more, and you do remove some potentially desirable volatile aromas, but you also get to keep a lot. So for those of you that are using a continuous still for your bourbon, it could potentially work quite well for single malt. But you're probably not going to go buy a new still just for American single malt. You're probably going to use the tool you have, and you're just going to have to learn how to use it best for American single malt if that's not what you purchased your still for. But there are a lot of options amongst all the stills out there to make a really good American single malt. So just kind of up to you to find how best to utilize your still. All right, so I've done a good amount of trials. This trial was actually from 2019. I was going to do a poster at the WDSC. I always forget up in Edinburgh in 2020, but good old COVID hit, and some of this data just kind of sat and ended up on a poster, but didn't have too much else to do with it. One thing we did was we utilized the Grainfather G30 brewing and distilling system, and we made 5-gallon batches. We did off-grain, closed fermentation, M1 yeast, 8% ABV. We just used the pot still attachment, and we did sensory on the new make. It was really interesting. We had a giant panel of folks. We limited our data to just 6 people that were familiar with spirits. We probably should have had a control that we could have tasted against some of these. That would have been great. But I'm going to share with you the top 3 that we did in terms of what people thought would ultimately end up being one of the best spirits. So we did one that was 50% just 2-row base malt and 50% Weyermann Munich, and people really loved how malty and nutty this turned out. It ended up being a bit nuttier than breadier, and there was a bit of a spicy note, and a lot of other things that kind of got pulled out. But the amount of contribution that Munich actually had was really surprising. It definitely changed the dynamic of the spirit. And we also had, with this malt, a bit more perceived sweetness and mouthfeel than we thought we would without it. And on to caramel malt. So 10% Dingaman Special B. Dingaman Special B is a dark caramel malt. It's about 150 lava bond. And it ended up, I think, being the fan favorite of all of these. It produced a ton of dark fruit notes, dark caramel notes, toffee. I think I was one of the folks that got a bit of molasses on this, and just some dried fruit notes. And it really, I mean, as a new make spirit, the aroma was intense in terms of the amount of caramel and dried fruit. And then you started getting some of those dark fruit notes on your palate. It was really nice. And lastly was the 10% Simpson's chocolate. This one had noticeable coffee notes in the nose and on the palate, and I do believe that we had a few folks that believed it was a bit spicy as well, which was kind of interesting. This was a close second, I believe, in terms of what people thought could happen in the barrel, and in terms of what oak might bring to the table with this dark malt. So, oddly enough, the one thing that I remember about this one was just how dynamic it was. There were a lot of flavors going on, and I think that's why a lot of folks were writing spicy, black pepper, gingery. I feel like there was even some folks that were really convinced they were getting some gingerbread notes as well as the espresso notes. So it was a really cool malt. So just to kind of wrap some of this up, I really do think we're going to start to see a lot more technical information on this, some organoleptic data. We're going to really look deep into what can be done with specialty malt in single malt whiskey. One thing that I started working on was some peated malt, and I did it in small amounts. And in conjunction with a few other specialty malts, it's really interesting in terms of what I expect I will get. It's currently sitting in the fermenter, so I think it's going to be a really interesting one. One thing to consider about specialty malts in general is that we can use them across any whiskey we want, really. We can use caramel rye, we can use caramel malt, we can use chocolate malt in anything, really. There's nothing that's stopping us. It's barley malt. It's allowed in every type of whiskey. So really just up to your imagination. And definitely start doing some of your own experiments. I think there's a real opportunity for this to be one of the easiest ways to gain some house flavor in the single malt whiskey space. So there's a world of possibilities with this malt. And just as an FYI, if you're hitting up the expo floor, we do have some new make spirit at our booth with some specialty malts in it for you to try. So hopefully that gives you a general idea in terms of what specialty malt can do and things to consider as you go on your single malt journey. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Aaron. Any questions for Aaron? A couple of hands. Here you go.
Just out of curiosity, have you seen any American single malt whiskey producers using acidulated malt to monitor their or to help set their pH for mashing?
That's a great question. Yes, I have actually, and I had maybe the same light bulb you did. I think I could really soften the whiskey nicely, really smooth it out. Yep.
In the beginning, you mentioned having a specialty malt for distillers. You went through a whole lot of nice brewers malts there. What's missing?
Well, I think what would end up developing are specialty malts that are tweaked slightly to provide as dynamic a malt as possible that can kind of survive the challenges of the distilling process all the way through. And actually, to my point on that last slide, I think if we start doing the sensory work and collecting the data and marketing specifically to distillers, and with that data, it kind of becomes a distiller's malt, because that's where we're putting our efforts, not into the brewing data, but actually into the sensory of the new make and what's coming out of the barrel. So I'd love to see that happen.
Back here. You mentioned that the inclusion of specialty malts and using new barrels that will take longer to mature. What's the thought, or the theory behind that?
The thought is that you're creating there's a lot more going on in the barrel just because of those flavors, and so there's a lot more volatiles that need to settle out. My thought is that you're developing a lot of flavors through the oak and through the grain, and so unless you're looking for something that is very specific and singular in flavor, I think you kind of need to let some of those really high notes settle out so that you're actually getting a much broader scope of the flavors that are in there. Because I will say one thing, it seems like single malt can be very, very dynamic, but it also can be very singular if you don't treat it right.
So kind of on the same topic as my colleague here, I'm just curious, specialty malts becoming more marketed towards distillers, is there an opportunity for the malts to be modified where the protein structure or the enzyme package are better suited for distillers, but still have the same flavors that we're looking at, as brewers?
Yeah, totally. I mean, actually, some of the high kilned malts that are coming off the still, somewhere between those specialty base malts and those high kiln malts, you're still having some enzymes survive, and you're still really retaining the entire starch package. We could start looking at barley varieties and malting techniques that are maybe somewhat unique in the sense that we drive high heat at the end of the kiln process to try to drive some of that in and then shut it off right before we lose the entire enzyme package, just so you can use it as a larger portion of your distillate. So yeah, I think there's some opportunities. Personally, haven't thought it through all the way, and I think there's some opportunity to do that.
You briefly touched on mouthfeel on a couple of the slides. Which characteristics in the specialty malts do you find correlate with positive and negative mouthfeel drivers?
What I've typically found is when you've got the really long chain sugars, and those can adhere and come through the still, especially in on-grain purposes, which is why I mentioned the caramel. And I always say it's perceived mouthfeel. It's just that you get a little bit more across the palate from some of those malts, and of course it's going to depend on the malt and how you distill it and how it's fermented and that sort of thing. But I really do think there's an opportunity to experiment with distillation process and some of those specialty malts to create a bit more mouthfeel.
All right. Well, thank you, Aaron. Yep. And thank you all for coming. So that concludes this session. Lunch is down in the Champions Kitchen, and it is provided by Vendome today. So thank you all very much. Have a great day.